What might surprise many people is that what many churches teach as being right and wrong isn't what the Bible teaches. A man came up to Jesus and he says, "What is the greatest commandment?" And Jesus says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart." He answered the question. But then he volunteered the second. The second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. And then he made a comment which is really important. All the law depends on these two commands. So every commandment in the Bible is somehow related to these two. Oh, look at this. After Jesus and the rest of the New Testament, they keep referring back to this. Galatians 5:14. For the whole law can be summed up in a single command. You must love your neighbor as yourself. That would be Paul. Let's look at John. John 5. And now I ask you, lady, not as if I was writing a new commandment to you, but the one that we have had from the beginning, that we love one another. Okay, so Paul and John believe that the law is summarized by loving one another. And now we have James 2:8. But if you fulfill the royal law, as expressed in this scripture, you shall love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing well. So what we see is after Jesus, the whole church in the New Testament, this was the basis of their ethics. Right and wrong was based only on loving your neighbor as yourself. The Old Testament reflects God's love of people. You see many commandments in the Old Testament concerned about the treatment of the poor, of foreigners, of orphans and widows. When a farmer picked his crop, he had to leave the corners unpicked so that the foreigners and the poor and the widows and the orphans could pick that and have something to eat. When the farmer went through his land, he could make one pass. If he missed anything, whatever was left was available for the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the foreigners to pick. If somebody was very poor and had to sell his land, after a number of years, he would get the land back. What you see in the Old Testament is God cared for the poor, the orphans, the foreigners, and he expected everybody else to care for them also. How concerned was God with loving your neighbor in the Old Testament? Isaiah 1. Listen to the Lord's message. You leaders of Sodom, pay attention to the God's rebuke, you people of Gomorrah. Okay, if he calls the people like they're Sodom and Gomorrah, this is pretty darn serious. We're going to go through this section of Isaiah chapter 1 because what it shows is a lot of the things that people think of being religious, things that you would think that God would love. He says, wait a minute, these don't matter to me. And then he talks about what really does matter to him. In verse 12, when you enter my presence, do you actually think I want this? It's like people thinking that just because they go to church that somehow God should be thrilled by that. And he isn't. Here he starts talking about meaningless offerings. Let's think of that as tithing. So he says, I don't care about your tithes. I don't care about your money. I consider your incense detestable. You observe new moon festivals, Sabbath, I cannot tolerate your sin-stained celebrations. That would be kind of like Christmas. Here he puts the capper on it. I don't even care about your prayers. When you pray to me, I'm not even going to listen. So I'm not going to listen to your prayers. I don't care about your tithes. I don't care whether you come to church. Why not? So why is God not going to listen to their prayers? Isaiah 1:17. Learn to do right. Promote justice. Give the oppressed reason to celebrate. Take up the cause of the orphan. Defend the rights of the widow. So you can see he's not listening to their prayers because they're evil people. They rob, they steal, they murder, they rape. Wait a minute. In 17, they're not really doing anything wrong. They're not kicking the widow, and they're not beating up the orphan. He's upset because they don't care. They see somebody abusing the orphans. They see somebody taking advantage of the widows. They see the poor being oppressed, and they don't care. Not their problem. They don't get involved. So God is saying, if you don't get involved, when you see people being oppressed, when you see the poor being taken advantage of, and you just sit and watch, I'm not interested in listening to your prayers. I don't care whether you go to church. I don't care whether you tithe. In the story of the Good Samaritan, Jesus pushes the point. A man came up to Jesus and says, well, if I'm supposed to love my neighbor, who's my neighbor? And Jesus comes back with the story of the Good Samaritan. Now in the story, this man was going to Jerusalem and he got robbed. And he got beaten up and left for dead. And who walks by? Two religious leaders. And they don't do anything. Jesus is saying they should have. They should have gotten involved. They were sinning. Now bear in mind, they didn't spit on the man on the ground. They didn't kick him. They didn't hurt him anyway. They just walked on by. And Jesus is saying, that's a sin. They weren't loving their neighbor because they didn't get involved. Now the Samaritan, he got involved. Now the Samaritans didn't get along with the Jews. The Samaritans are the leftovers of the 10 tribes that lived in northern Israel. And they had a version of the Bible, of the Old Testament, first 5 books of the Bible, but it was different. It was corrupted. They changed a lot of the place names from the southern part of Judah to where the 10 tribes lived. And so the Jews viewed them almost like a cult, or almost like they were corrupting the Bible. And so they didn't get along very well. The Good Samaritan probably didn't have any warm fuzzies about this Jew laying in the road. He probably didn't care much for him. But he still got involved. Now bear in mind, the 2 religious leaders didn't get involved because they were afraid that the robbers would come back, and that was a concern. So the Samaritan was taking a risk to help the Jew. Not only that, he took him to an inn and he paid for the inn to take care of him. Jesus is saying the same thing that Isaiah was, that If you're going to fulfill the royal law to love your neighbor, that isn't being a paperweight Christian. You have to get involved. Okay, to summarize, to understand what God considers to be right and wrong is going to be important when we study the book of Romans. But it also is important for us just to understand this. Too often, churches get caught up in the trivial. Oh, tattoos are wrong. Oh, that's a sin to smoke. Oh, a beer is so evil. And I remember one time when I was growing up, my father was a pastor, and we had a visitor from Michigan. And after the church service, the people were talking about him, saying how evil he was, because after the church service, he smoked in the church parking lot. Meanwhile, he went back to Michigan and said how evil our church people were because they mowed their lawns on Sunday afternoons. Unfortunately, our churches get tied up in the trivial. And the two laws, love God with all your heart and to love your neighbor, to treat people nice, that's not trivial. Those are important. How we treat people defines our Christianity. When we're looking to determine whether something is right and wrong, we should ask ourselves, does it dishonor God? Does it mistreat people? So if I ask myself, is having a tattoo a sin? Well, does that show disrespect to God? No. Does that hurt my neighbor? No. So getting a tattoo is not a sin. Is getting a beer a sin? Well, does that show disrespect to God? No. Does that hurt my neighbor? No. Then it isn't a sin. Does smoking a cigarette a sin? Does that show disrespect to God? No. Does it hurt my neighbor? No. So it's not a sin. We need to get our ethics back to the first two laws, the only two laws in the Bible. Love God and love your neighbor. Be nice to people. Next lesson, we're going to get back to the fairness of requiring people to know Jesus for salvation.